Richard Blake had everything a person could want. At 35 years old, he owned 5 luxury cars, a huge mansion on a hill, and more money than he could spend in his life. His days were filled with business meetings, expensive dinners, and parties with other rich people. But deep inside, Richard felt empty and bored. One Friday night, Richard sat with his wealthy friends at their private club. They drank expensive drinks and talked about their boring problems. Jack complained about his new yacht being too small. Victoria whined about her chef not making perfect meals. Richard looked around the table and felt tired of it all. "I need something new, something exciting," Richard said, taking another drink. His friends laughed. "What more could you possibly want?" asked Thomas, his friend since college. "You have everything." Richard stared into his glass. "That's the problem. Life is too easy, too predictable. I want something that will shake things up." Jack, always ready for trouble, smiled. "Then let's make a bet. Something crazy that will wake you up." The table got quiet as everyone leaned in. They loved bets and challenges, especially after a few drinks. "I dare you to marry someone completely different from us," Jack said with a wicked smile. "Someone no one would expect. Like a homeless person." The table erupted in laughter. Victoria nearly spit out her drink. "That's insane," Thomas said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Even Richard isn't that crazy." But Richard didn't laugh. A strange feeling came over him. The idea was shocking, inappropriate, and completely outrageous. But it was also exactly the kind of shake-up he craved. How long would this marriage need to last? Richard asked quietly. The table went silent. They couldn't believe he was actually considering it. 1 year, Jack said, his eyes wide with surprise. Marry a homeless woman for 1 full year. Live with her. Be seen in public with her. The whole thing. I'll bet $1 million you can't do it. Make it 2 million, Thomas added, and the money goes to charity if you win. Richard nodded slowly. Deal. The next morning, Richard woke up with a pounding headache. At first, he thought the bet was just a bad dream. But text messages from his friends confirmed it was real. Instead of feeling regret, Richard felt a strange excitement. For the first time in years, he didn't know what would happen next. He showered, skipped his usual fancy breakfast, and drove his least flashy car downtown. He parked near a homeless shelter and watched people coming in and out. What was he doing? This was crazy. He should just pay the bet money and forget about it. But then he saw her. A woman about 28 years old stood near the shelter entrance. She didn't look how Richard expected a homeless person to look. Her clothes were worn but clean. Her brown hair was tied back neatly. Most striking were her eyes. Clear, alert, and filled with a quiet dignity despite her circumstances. Richard watched as she helped an older man with his bags, then gave her coffee to a shivering teenager. There was something about her that made Richard get out of his car. "Excuse me," he said, approaching her slowly. She turned, her eyes instantly wary. "Can I help you?" "My name is Richard Blake," he said, suddenly feeling foolish in his expensive clothes and with his absurd plan. "I'm Sarah," she replied simply, her eyes studying him. "You look lost, Mr. Blake. This isn't your usual neighborhood, is it?" Richard took a deep breath. "No, it's not. And I have a very unusual question to ask you." Sarah raised an eyebrow, keeping a careful distance between them. "I'm listening." Richard had practiced different ways to explain his idea on the drive over, but now all his clever words failed him. How could he possibly explain this crazy bet without sounding like a complete jerk? "This might sound insane," he started, "but what would you say if I asked you to marry me?" Sarah stared at Richard for a long moment. Her face showed no emotion, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Is this some kind of joke?" she finally asked. "Because it's not funny." Richard shook his head quickly. "No joke. I'm serious. You want to marry me. A complete stranger. A homeless woman." Sarah crossed her arms. Why would a rich man like you want to do that? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He couldn't tell her about the bet. That would be too cruel, even for him. It's complicated, he said. Can we talk somewhere more private? Maybe get some coffee? Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Most people would think she was crazy to even consider talking more with this strange rich man. But Sarah had good instincts about people. This man seemed odd, but not dangerous. There's a cheap coffee shop around the corner, she said finally. You're buying. The coffee shop was small and noisy. Richard felt out of place in his expensive clothes. People stared at him. He wasn't used to being somewhere where he didn't fit in. After they sat down with their drinks, Sarah spoke first. Tell me the real reason, she demanded. I've dealt with enough lies on the streets to spot them easily. Richard took a deep breath. He couldn't tell her everything, but he could tell some truth. My life is empty, he admitted. I have money, cars, a big house, but no purpose, no real connections. I want to shake things up, do something completely different. So I'm just an adventure for you, a way to feel better about your sad rich life. Sarah's voice was sharp, but not angry. Richard winced. When you say it that way, it sounds terrible. Because it is terrible, Sarah replied. She started to stand up. Thanks for the coffee. Wait, Richard said quickly. Please, there's more. Sarah slowly sat back down. If you marry me for 1 year, Richard explained, you'll get a place to live, good food, new clothes, and when the year is done, I'll give you enough money to start a new life. Buy a home, go to school, whatever you want. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. How much money? $2 million, Richard said. Sarah almost choked on her coffee. 2 million. You must be joking. I'm not, Richard assured her. It's nothing to me. I make that much in a week. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. People lived and died on the streets, while others had so much money they could throw it away on strange bets. What exactly would I have to do? She asked carefully. Live in my house. Come to some parties with me. Be seen as my wife, Richard explained. Nothing physical, he added quickly. You'd have your own room. Sarah thought about her life. 8 months ago, she had a job and an apartment. Then the company closed. She couldn't find work, and everything fell apart so quickly. Now she slept in shelters when lucky, on park benches when not. People will think I'm your charity case, she said, or worse. Richard nodded. Probably. Does that bother you? Sarah laughed bitterly. People already look at me like I'm nothing. At least in your world, they'd have to pretend to be polite about it. She stared out the window for a long time. This was crazy. This man was probably crazy, or he had some dark secret plan. But what choice did she really have? Winter was coming. The shelters would be overcrowded. And $2 million. I have conditions, Sarah said suddenly, turning back to Richard. Richard raised his eyebrows in surprise. Conditions? Yes. First, I want everything in writing. A real contract that a lawyer checks, Sarah stated firmly. Second, I want half the money put in an account I can access after 6 months, so I know you won't just change your mind. Richard was impressed. Sarah was smarter than he expected. Third, she continued, I won't be your servant or your toy. I'll be treated with respect. Anything else? Richard asked, trying not to show his surprise. Yes, I want to understand why you're really doing this, Sarah said, her eyes locked on his. The full truth, not the story you think I want to hear. Richard felt trapped. He couldn't tell her about the bet. It would ruin everything. Sometimes, the truth isn't simple, he said carefully. Neither is marriage, Sarah replied, even a fake one. Richard looked into his coffee cup, avoiding Sarah's eyes. The noisy coffee shop suddenly felt very quiet to him. He had to make a choice. The truth is, he started slowly. I made a bet with my friends. Sarah's face turned hard. A bet? Yes. They bet me $2 million that I wouldn't marry someone from a different world than mine. For 1 year. Richard finally looked up. That's the full truth. Sarah stood up so fast her chair fell backward. People turned to look. Her face was red with anger and hurt. So I'm just a bet to you. A joke for rich people to laugh at. Her voice shook. You people think poor folks are just toys for your games. Richard stood too, feeling shame wash over him. Sarah, please. I know it sounds bad. It doesn't sound bad. It is bad. Sarah grabbed her worn jacket. Find someone else for your sick game. She walked out of the coffee shop into the cold morning. Richard quickly put money on the table and followed her. Sarah, wait. He called, catching up to her on the sidewalk. Please listen. Why should I? She asked, not slowing down. Because yes, it started as a stupid bet, Richard admitted, walking beside her. But meeting you changed things. You're not what I expected. Sarah stopped suddenly. What did you expect? Some dirty, crazy person who would fall at your feet with gratitude. Richard looked down, unable to deny it. Something like that, he admitted quietly. Sarah shook her head. At least you're honest now. They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the city moved with its usual noise and hurry. People walked past, some looking at them curiously. The well-dressed man and the obviously homeless woman having what seemed like a serious talk. The bet is real, Richard finally said. But so is the money. $2 million that could change your life. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Do you know what it's like? Being homeless. Richard shook his head. People look through you, not at you, she explained, like you're not even human anymore. Just a problem. Just something ugly they don't want to see. Richard felt uncomfortable. He had never thought about it that way. I had a normal life before, Sarah continued. I was an office manager, had an apartment, friends, plans for the future. Then the company closed. No jobs anywhere. My savings lasted 3 months. Then, she gestured to the street around them. I'm sorry, Richard said, and he meant it. Your pity doesn't help me, Sarah replied sharply. Then her voice softened. But your money could. They walked slowly together toward the park. The morning was getting warmer. Children played while mothers watched. Normal life happening all around them. If I agree to this crazy plan, Sarah said finally, it won't be because I like you or think this bet is okay. It will be because I need a chance to start over. Richard nodded. That's fair. And I want something else, Sarah added. What? I want to meet these friends of yours, the ones who made this bet. Her eyes were determined. I want to see their faces when you tell them I know about the bet, and I'm doing this anyway. Richard smiled slightly, impressed by her courage. You really want to face them? Yes, Sarah said firmly. If they want to laugh at me, they can do it to my face. Richard thought about it. His friends would be shocked. They expected him to find someone desperate who would know nothing about the bet, someone they could mock easily at a safe distance. Sarah wasn't playing by those rules. Okay, he agreed. We'll meet them together. Sarah held out her hand. Then we have a deal, Mr. Richard Blake. 1 year of fake marriage in exchange for a real future. Richard shook her hand, feeling something unexpected. Respect. There's one more thing, Sarah said, not letting go of his hand. When the year is over and I have my money, I want you to admit to everyone that I was the best thing that ever happened to you. Richard laughed. And why would I say that? Sarah finally smiled, just a little. Because by then, it will be true. 3 days later, Sarah stood in front of Richard's mansion, her small bag of belongings at her feet. The house was bigger than any building she had ever been inside. It had tall white columns and more windows than she could count. Beautiful gardens spread out on all sides. This is where you live? She asked, her voice small. All by yourself? Richard nodded. Well, not completely alone. There's the staff. Staff, Sarah repeated, trying to understand a world where one person needed many others just to take care of their home. As they walked to the front door, it opened. A middle-aged woman in a neat black dress stood there. "Welcome home, Mr. Blake," she said, her face carefully blank when she saw Sarah. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. This is Sarah," Richard said. "She will be staying here. She is." He paused. "My fiancée." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened just a little, but she quickly controlled her surprise. "I see. Welcome, Miss Sarah." "Just Sarah is fine," Sarah said, feeling strange in her old clothes in this fancy place. Inside, the house was even more impressive. The floors were shiny marble. Expensive paintings hung on the walls. Fresh flowers sat in big vases. Sarah had seen places like this in movies, but never thought she would stand in one. "Mrs. Chen is my housekeeper," Richard explained as they walked through the huge entry hall. "She manages the house and the other staff." "How many staff do you have?" Sarah asked. "Let's see. Mrs. Chen, the cook, 2 maids, a gardener, my driver, and my personal assistant who works from the guest house," Richard counted. "So 7 people." Sarah shook her head in wonder. 7 people just for you." Richard showed Sarah to her room. It was bigger than the entire apartment she used to have. It had a large bed with soft-looking blankets, a sitting area with comfortable chairs, and a bathroom with a tub big enough to swim in. "This will be your space," Richard said. "No one will bother you here." Sarah walked slowly around the room, touching things carefully as if they might break. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "The closet is empty," Richard continued. "Tomorrow we'll get you new clothes." Sarah turned to him. "I can't wear my own clothes here." "You can," Richard said quickly, "but you'll need different clothes for public events, for our story to work." Sarah nodded, understanding. Her worn jeans and faded shirts would not fit in Richard's world. "I had Mrs. Chen prepare dinner for us," Richard said. "We should probably talk more about how this will work." At dinner, Sarah sat across from Richard at a table that could fit 20 people. The dining room was grand, with crystal chandeliers and tall windows looking out at the garden. A man in a uniform served them food that Sarah had never seen before. "Is this normal for you?" Sarah asked, looking at the fancy plates and many forks. "Eating like this every night?" Richard looked around as if seeing it all for the first time. "Yes, I suppose it is." "It seems lonely," Sarah said honestly. "This big table with just you." Richard was quiet for a moment. "I never thought about it that way." After dinner, they sat in a room Richard called the small living room, though it was bigger than most homes. He explained how their plan would work. "We'll announce our engagement tomorrow," he said. "People will be shocked, of course." "What will you tell them about me?" Sarah asked. "The truth, mostly," Richard decided. "That we met by chance. That we connected. We'll just leave out the bet part." "And when do I meet your friends? The ones who made the bet?" Sarah asked. "There's a party here this weekend," Richard said. "They'll all be here." Sarah looked nervous for the first time. "What if I embarrass you? I don't know how to act around rich people." "Just be yourself," Richard said. Then he smiled a little. Actually, that might be the best way to shock them. Later that night, Sarah stood by the window in her new room. The moon lit up the beautiful gardens outside. Just a week ago, she had been sleeping in a shelter, wondering where her next meal would come from. Now she was in a mansion, part of a strange plan that could change her life forever. She thought about the party coming up, where she would meet Richard's rich friends. They would stare at her, judge her, whisper about her. "Let them," she said to her reflection in the window. "I'm stronger than they know." The day of the party came quickly. Sarah spent the morning with a woman named Melissa, a personal shopper Richard had hired. Melissa brought many dresses for Sarah to try on. "Mr. Blake said money is no object," Melissa said, hanging up beautiful dresses in colors Sarah had never worn. We want you to look perfect tonight." Sarah touched a blue dress that felt softer than anything she had ever owned. "I don't know how to wear these kinds of clothes." Melissa smiled kindly. "I'll help you. By tonight, you'll look like you were born in high society." After choosing a simple but elegant dark green dress, Sarah also had her hair and makeup done by professionals Richard sent to the house. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. "Is that really me?" she whispered, touching her face carefully. The woman doing her makeup smiled. "You're naturally beautiful. We just enhanced what was already there." By evening, the mansion was transformed for the party. Lights glowed in the gardens. Music played softly. Staff in black and white uniforms moved around with trays of food and drinks. Sarah watched from her window as fancy cars arrived and well-dressed people stepped out. There was a knock at her door. Richard stood there in a black suit that probably cost more than a car. He stopped when he saw Sarah in her green dress, her hair styled elegantly. "You look," he started, then stopped. "You look beautiful." Sarah felt her face get warm. "Thank you. Your expensive people did good work." "It's not the dress or the hair," Richard said quietly. "It's you." They walked downstairs together. Richard offered his arm, and Sarah took it, grateful for the support. Her new shoes were not easy to walk in. "Remember," Richard whispered as they reached the bottom of the stairs, "you don't need to explain yourself to anyone." The party guests turned to stare as they entered. Sarah could hear the whispers start immediately. Women in expensive jewelry leaned toward each other, eyes wide. Men in suits looked confused. Richard's three closest friends, Jack, Thomas, and Victoria, stood near the drinks table. Their mouths opened in shock when they saw Sarah. "Richard," Victoria recovered first, air kissing his cheeks. "You didn't tell us you were bringing someone special tonight." Her eyes moved over Sarah from head to toe, looking for flaws. "This is Sarah," Richard said, his voice firm. "My fiancée." The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the ice clinking in glasses across the room. "Fiancé," Thomas repeated, "as in, getting married." "Next month," Richard said, squeezing Sarah's hand. "A small ceremony." Jack, who had started the bet, looked like he might faint. "But where did you two meet? I don't remember Sarah from any of our social events." This was the moment Richard and Sarah had prepared for. Sarah spoke before Richard could. "We met downtown," she said clearly, "outside a homeless shelter." Victoria choked on her drink. "I'm sorry. Did you say homeless shelter?" "Yes." Sarah continued calmly. "I was staying there at the time." The looks on their faces were exactly what Sarah had imagined. Shock, confusion, disgust poorly hidden behind fake smiles. Sarah was having a difficult time, Richard explained, his voice challenging anyone to make a comment. "We got talking, connected instantly." Thomas looked at Jack with wide eyes, silently asking if this was really about their bet. Jack seemed unable to speak. "Well," Victoria finally said, her voice high and tight. "How? Interesting. Unusual, but interesting." Other guests came over, curious about Richard's mysterious new fiancée. Everyone asked the same questions. "Where did you meet? What do you do? Who are your family?" Sarah answered honestly each time. She had been homeless. She used to work as an office manager. Her parents were both dead. She had no family money. With each honest answer, the guests looked more uncomfortable. But Sarah stood tall, her head high. She would not pretend to be someone else. Later, Sarah overheard two women talking in the bathroom. "It's obviously some kind of midlife crisis," one said. "Or a publicity stunt," the other replied. "Rich men do these things for attention." Sarah stepped out of the bathroom stall. The women froze when they saw her. "Actually," Sarah said with a small smile, "he's doing it for love." She washed her hands and walked out, leaving the women staring after her. A month after the party, Richard and Sarah got married in a small ceremony. Only a few people came. Richard's assistant, Mrs. Chen, and a lawyer who made sure all the papers were right. Jack, Thomas, and Victoria were not invited. After the wedding, life settled into a strange routine. Sarah and Richard lived in the same big house, but sometimes went days without seeing each other. Richard was often busy with work, leaving early and coming home late. Sarah spent her days exploring the mansion and its grounds. She found a library with more books than she could read in a lifetime. She discovered a garden area that no one used anymore. One morning, Mrs. Chen found Sarah pulling weeds in the forgotten garden. "Miss Sarah, you shouldn't be doing that," Mrs. Chen said, looking worried. "I can have the gardener take care of it." Sarah sat back on her heels, her hands dirty. "I like doing it, Mrs. Chen. It feels good to work with my hands again." Mrs. Chen looked confused. "But you're Mrs. Blake now, Richard's wife." "Only on paper," Sarah said quietly. Then she smiled. "And I need something to do, or I'll go crazy in this big house." After that, Sarah spent most days working in the garden. She cleared the weeds and planted flowers and vegetables. The gardener, an older man named Miguel, was surprised at first, but soon began helping her. He taught her about different plants and how to care for them. "You have a natural touch," Miguel told her. "These plants respond to you." One evening, Richard came home earlier than usual. He walked through the house looking for Sarah, but couldn't find her. Finally, Mrs. Chen directed him to the back garden. There, Richard stopped in surprise. The old, forgotten garden was now full of colorful flowers and neat rows of vegetables. In the middle of it all was Sarah, her clothes dirty, her face smiling as she watered some plants. "What is all this?" Richard asked, walking closer. Sarah turned, surprised to see him. "Oh, I hope you don't mind. The space wasn't being used, and I needed something to do." Richard looked around, truly impressed. "You did all this yourself?" "Miguel helped," Sarah said. "But yes, mostly me." Richard touched a bright red tomato growing on a vine. "I didn't know this garden could look like this. It was my mother's, actually. After she died, no one took care of it." Sarah hadn't known that. "I'm sorry. I can stop if you want." "No," Richard said quickly. "No, I think she would like what you've done with it." After that day, Richard started coming home earlier. Sometimes he would sit in the garden and watch Sarah work. Other times he would help her, learning how to plant seeds and pull weeds. His hands, soft from years of office work, soon had small calluses. One evening, they sat together on a bench in the garden after working side by side all afternoon. "Why do you like gardening so much?" Richard asked. Sarah thought about it. "When I was homeless, I felt invisible, like I didn't matter to the world. But plants don't care if you're rich or poor. They just respond to care and attention." Richard was quiet for a moment. "I never thought about it that way." "Also," Sarah added with a small smile, "it's nice to create something beautiful instead of just buying it." Richard laughed, but then looked serious. "My friends keep calling. They want to know if I'm still going through with our arrangement." "And what do you tell them?" Sarah asked. "I don't answer their calls anymore," Richard admitted. "They don't understand." "Understand what?" Sarah asked. Richard looked around at the garden they had worked on together. "That things are changing." That night, they had dinner together in the kitchen instead of the fancy dining room. The cook had gone home, so they made simple sandwiches. They talked for hours about their lives, their dreams, their disappointments. For the first time, it didn't feel like a rich man and a homeless woman forced together by a strange bet. It felt like two people getting to know each other, two people who might actually become friends. 3 months had passed since the wedding. Summer turned to fall, and the garden needed different care. Sarah and Richard spent many evenings planning what to plant next. One morning, Richard didn't go to work. Instead, he found Sarah in the kitchen having coffee with Mrs. Chen. "I have an idea," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "Let's use the extra land behind the garden. Sarah looked confused. For what? For a bigger garden. A community garden, Richard explained. People from the neighborhood could have their own small plots to grow food. Mrs. Chen looked surprised. In all her years working for Richard, she had never heard him suggest something like this. Sarah put down her coffee cup. The neighborhood? You mean the wealthy people who live around here? Richard shook his head. No, I mean people who need it. People from downtown. People from the shelter where we met. Now Sarah was truly shocked. You want to invite homeless people to your property? To garden? Why not? Richard asked. We have the space. It's just sitting there empty. Sarah studied his face. Where did this idea come from? Richard sat down at the table. Last night, I couldn't sleep. I was thinking about what you said about plants not caring if people are rich or poor. About creating something instead of buying it. He paused, and I thought about how much the garden has helped you. Maybe it could help others too. Sarah felt something warm grow in her chest. This was not the same Richard who had offered her a marriage deal for a bet. Your rich friends will think you've lost your mind, she said. Richard smiled. I don't care what they think anymore. The next day, they visited the homeless shelter together. Richard felt uncomfortable at first. He hadn't been back since the day he met Sarah. People stared at his expensive clothes and watch. Sarah knew many people there. She introduced Richard to the shelter manager, a kind woman named Donna. A community garden. Donna repeated after hearing their idea. That would be wonderful. Many people here would love to grow their own food. We can provide transportation, Richard added, and tools and seeds. Donna looked at him with surprise and a bit of suspicion. Why are you doing this, Mr. Blake? Most wealthy people just write checks. They don't invite the homeless to their homes. Richard looked at Sarah before answering. Let's just say I'm learning that there are more important things than money. Within 2 weeks, the community garden project began. Richard hired workers to prepare the land and build raised beds for planting. He bought tools, seeds, gloves, and everything else needed. The first day, the shelter residents came. 10 people arrived on a bus Richard had arranged. They looked nervous and out of place on the grand property. Sarah greeted them warmly. Welcome to our garden. Today, we'll each choose a plot and start preparing the soil. A thin man raised his hand. I've never grown anything before. I don't know how. I'll teach you, Sarah said with a smile. I was in your place just a few months ago. Richard watched as Sarah showed everyone what to do. She was patient and kind. The shelter residents gradually relaxed and became excited about their garden plots. One older woman approached Richard. You have a special wife, young man. Richard nodded. I know. Are you really a millionaire? She asked directly. Yes, Richard admitted. The woman looked around at the beautiful property. And you married a homeless woman and invited us here. Why? Richard watched Sarah kneeling in the dirt, showing a young man how to plant seeds properly. Her face was animated, happy. Because, Richard said quietly, I was the one who needed saving, not her. The community garden became a regular event. Twice a week, people from the shelter would come to work on their plots. Some of Richard's business associates thought he had gone crazy. A few even pulled out of deals with his company. But Richard didn't care. For the first time in his life, he was doing something that felt truly meaningful. 6 months had now passed since the wedding. The community garden was growing well. Winter was coming, so Richard had special greenhouse covers built over some of the garden areas so people could grow food all year. One cold morning, Richard sat in his home office looking serious. On his desk was a large calendar with a date circled in red. It was the halfway point of his 1-year agreement with Sarah. According to their contract, today half of the promised money, $1 million, would go into Sarah's bank account. Richard had already arranged the transfer. The money was now hers, no matter what happened with the rest of their arrangement. Richard stared at the calendar. 6 more months, and Sarah would leave with another $1 million. The thought made him feel strangely empty. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mrs. Chen. "Mr. Blake, you have visitors," she said, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Thomas, Mr. Jack, and Ms. Victoria are here." Richard frowned. His old friends had been calling for weeks, but he hadn't answered. Now they had just shown up. "Send them to the living room," he said. "I'll be right there." In the living room, his three friends stood looking out the windows at the community garden, where several people from the shelter were working despite the cold weather. "Richard," Victoria said when he entered. "Finally. We've been trying to reach you for ages." "I've been busy," Richard said simply. Jack pointed out the window. "We can see that." "What's going on, Richard?" "There are homeless people all over your property. They're working in the community garden," Richard explained. "They grow food for themselves and for the shelter." Thomas shook his head. "This is going too far, Richard. The bet was to marry a homeless woman for a year, not turn your estate into a charity." "This has nothing to do with the bet," Richard said firmly. Victoria moved closer to him. "Richard, dear, we're worried about you. This woman seems to be having a strange influence on you." "Her name is Sarah," Richard said coldly. "And yes, she has influenced me. For the better." Jack laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "Come on, Richard. You can't be serious. This was supposed to be a joke, a bit of fun. Now you're turning into some kind of social worker." "What's wrong with helping people?" Richard asked. "Nothing," Thomas said quickly. "But this is extreme. What's next? Will you give away all your money? Move to the shelter yourself?" The door opened and Sarah walked in. She was wearing work clothes and boots, with dirt on her hands from the garden. She stopped when she saw the visitors. "Oh, I didn't know we had company," she said. Victoria looked at Sarah's dirty clothes with clear disgust. Richard felt a flash of anger. "Sarah, you remember my friends," Richard said, moving to stand beside her. "They were just leaving." "No, we weren't," Jack said. "We came to talk some sense into you." Sarah looked at Richard. "Should I go?" "No," Richard said firmly. "This concerns you too." He turned to his friends. "Today marks 6 months of our marriage. According to our bet, I've won. Sarah and I have been married for half a year. The $2 million should go to the charity of my choice." "Fine," Thomas said. "Name your charity and we'll send the money." Richard smiled. "I choose the homeless shelter downtown. And I'm matching your donation with $2 million of my own." His friends looked shocked. $4 million for a homeless shelter? Victoria asked, her voice high. "Richard, that's insane." "Actually," Sarah spoke up, her voice steady despite the tension in the room, "it's the most sane thing I've ever heard." Jack turned to her, his face angry. "This is all because of you. You filled his head with this charity nonsense." Sarah didn't back down. "Richard makes his own choices, just like he chose to tell me about your cruel bet from the beginning." The three friends froze, looking from Sarah to Richard. "You told her?" Thomas asked, his face pale. "From the start?" Richard nodded. "Of course I did. Our marriage may have begun as a bet, but it quickly became something else. Something real." Victoria grabbed her purse. "I think we've seen enough. Come on, boys. Richard clearly isn't himself anymore." As they left, Jack turned back. "The bet is still on, Richard. 6 more months. Let's see if you still feel this way when it's over and she takes your money and runs." After they left, Sarah turned to Richard. "Are you okay?" Richard looked out the window at the community garden, then back at Sarah. "I've never been better." 1 year had passed. It was the day their agreement would end. Richard sat alone in the garden early that morning. The community plots were thriving. Over 40 people from the shelter now came regularly to work on them. Some had even found jobs through connections they made while gardening. Sarah had been quiet the past few days. Richard knew she was thinking about their agreement ending. Today, the second $1 million would go into her account. Today, she was free to leave. Richard looked at the special section of the garden where Sarah had planted roses. They were blooming beautifully. Everything she touched seemed to grow strong and healthy. "There you are." Sarah's voice came from behind him. She sat down on the bench beside him. "Just thinking," Richard said. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunrise over the garden. "So," Sarah finally said, "today's the day." Richard nodded. "The money is already in your account. The full amount, as promised." "Thank you," Sarah said simply. More silence followed. A year ago, they had been strangers making an unusual deal. Now, after months of working side by side, eating meals together, and building something meaningful, they were, what exactly? "What are your plans?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Sarah looked at her hands. "I've been looking at small houses. There's one near the college I like. I'm thinking of going back to school." Richard felt his heart sink. "That sounds nice." "The community garden project needs to continue," Sarah added, "even if I'm not here." "Of course," Richard said quickly. "It will. I promise." Sarah turned to face him. "Richard, this year has been the strangest of my life. I went from having nothing to having everything. And now you have the means to do whatever you want," Richard said. "You never have to see this place again if you don't want to." Sarah looked surprised. "Is that what you think I want? To leave and never look back?" Richard shrugged. "It would make sense. Our arrangement was business. You fulfilled your part." Sarah stood up suddenly. "Come with me. I want to show you something." She led him to a part of the garden they'd rarely visited. In a small private corner, she had planted something new. It was a tiny oak tree, just a sapling. "I planted this yesterday," Sarah explained. "Oak trees take decades to grow. They can live for hundreds of years." Richard looked confused. "It's beautiful, but—" "I didn't plant it for me to enjoy now," Sarah interrupted. "I planted it for us to watch grow together. For years to come." Richard's heart started beating faster. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Sarah said, taking his hands in hers, "that I don't want our arrangement to end. Not the way we planned." "But the bet," Richard started. "Forget the bet," Sarah said firmly. "That's not why I'm staying. I'm staying because somewhere between that first coffee shop meeting and now, I fell in love with you." Richard felt like he couldn't breathe. "You love me?" Sarah nodded. "The real you, not the rich man who made a stupid bet. The man who works in the garden with his hands dirty. The man who gives without expecting anything back. The man who learned to see people instead of problems." Richard pulled her close. "I love you too. I think I have for months now, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid you'd think it was just another way to keep you here." Sarah smiled. "Well, it worked." Later that day, Richard called his old friends to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, the same one where he and Sarah had their first real conversation a year ago. Jack, Thomas, and Victoria arrived looking curious. They hadn't spoken to Richard in months. "So, the year is up," Jack said, sitting down. "Did she take the money and run?" Richard shook his head. "No, she's staying." "Staying for more money?" Victoria asked suspiciously. "No," Richard said. "Staying because we're getting married. For real this time." His friends looked shocked. Thomas recovered first. "You can't be serious. You're already married." "That was a contract," Richard explained. "This time it's about love." Jack laughed in disbelief. "Love? You actually fell in love with her?" Richard smiled. "Best bet I ever lost." As Richard walked home, he thought about how strangely life works. He had made a bet to marry a homeless woman for fun, expecting nothing but a year of inconvenience. Instead, he found a partner who showed him a better way to live, a woman who taught him that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in how many lives you touch. Richard looked up at the blue sky and smiled. "You really won't believe what happens next."